I'm Mike Gill. I actually served twice in the military. I served in 1966 through 1969 on active duty. My contract was up in 1972. From 69 to 72, I was a non-drilling reservist. And then my contract ended in 1972, as I said, in June. I enlisted actually right out of high school at the age of 17. And then I was out for 10 years. I always wanted to really be back in the Navy or in the reserves, but my work schedule didn't allow for that. The drilling reservists, at that point in time, they were drilling like every Wednesday night. Well, I was in the restaurant business, so I worked every Wednesday night, so I couldn't drill. And about 1982, that all changed, and the drills were being held on weekends. And at that time, I had changed jobs and I had weekends off, so it was really nice. I could go back into the reserve. So in 1982, I enlisted in the reserve program and stayed in the reserve program until 2002, when I actually retired. And I retired as an E7. So I was a chief petty officer in the Navy, or middle management to most civilians. So, and in the meantime, I had actually joined the U.S. Naval Sea Cadet program. So was working with that as well. When I was in my early teens, I remember I had an older cousin who had enlisted in the Navy, and he and the Navy were not too friendly with each other. He'd gotten into some difficulty, and I remember my mother talking about that and talking how upset my aunt was that he was not doing well and he was creating some issues, and so that kind of stuck with me. I don't know why it did, but that was in my early teens. He was several years older than I was. So when I graduated from high school at the age of 17, I knew I wasn't prepared for college. Nor could my parents afford to send me, even if I had been academically prepared. So the options were, I really didn't have any. I couldn't have been drafted, and that was in 1966. That was when Vietnam was really cranking up. We were sending more and more troops to Vietnam, and the draft was really in full swing. Although I could never have been drafted because I was legally blind in one eye. Really, I had very few options. I didn't have a lot of work experience, so very few people were going to hire a 17-year-old for any decent paying jobs at that point. So I decided to give the Navy a try, and as luck would have it, I made it. And so therefore that's what started my career off. My primary job in the Navy was food service. I was a food service specialist. And that's why I went into the restaurant business after I left active duty. And actually, when I started to college, that's what I majored in, was hotel and restaurant and institutional management. So the Navy career sort of led into my career in civilian life. So that's what I did as far as an actual occupation for the Navy. I was stationed on 2 World War II destroyers, class destroyers, and the living conditions were tight. I do have some photographs of what the living conditions were like. You would have anywhere from 30 to 45 to 60 people living in a small compartment, and usually stacked 3 high on a destroyer. So it's very, very, very tight living conditions, and you had there was no privacy at all on the ship. So. It was interesting living conditions. In those days, it was really difficult for non-smokers because they were people were still allowed to smoke in the compartments, and they were allowed to smoke in most every part of the ship. For a non-smoker, those were pretty really difficult conditions. Nowadays, that's not the case. There's no smoking inside the ship whatsoever, so that makes it a little bit easier for the newer people. But, yeah, so the living conditions were difficult. Two primary means of communication in those days was letters and occasional phone calls if you were in home port. My home port was Mayport, Florida. We didn't spend a lot of time there. We were at sea quite often, so when we did get port, we would, all of us would call home, and then we'd have mail call every day when we were at sea, so most people were writing letters, and there's nothing like it is today where you can actually do emails and doing online chats and different things of that nature. Couldn't do that in the 60s. When we were at sea, the way we worked at sea was we worked 1 day off and 1 day on. And that was primarily due to the long hours. The way it worked is that we would normally come on duty after breakfast. We would work lunch and dinner, and then breakfast the next day. Normally, you would be getting up around 4 o'clock in the morning to get ready to serve breakfast at 6 o'clock. And then in the evening, you would probably, if you were working the evening shift, you would get done maybe 7, 8 o'clock at night. So it was, but by breaking up the day so that you didn't come on until after breakfast, it made it a little bit easier than working straight through breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that made it a little bit easier. In port, it was a little bit different. We worked what we called a 5 and 2. We would work 5 days on and 2 days off. Now, when you worked straight through the 5 days on, you worked all 3 meals all 5 days. So that made for some pretty long days, but you were then off 2 days, and the other crew would come in and work their 5, or anyway, you only, out of 14 days, you only worked 7 days. So that's the way it worked out. So you got a 5-day break, in there. So that made it pretty nice. But that is the way it was, port, in port. And we normally had, in the galley, we'd normally have 3 people working in the galley. You'd have 2 cooks and what we called a food service assistant. In those days, we called them a mess cook. They did the washing of the dishes, the peeling of the potatoes, preparing vegetables, that sort of thing. And then you had the 2 cooks doing the main courses and anything. At one point, I served as a night baker, and I would work at night baking bread and pies and making the desserts for the next day's meals. That sort of thing. I did that for 6 months on my last cruise. In regards to were we welcomed home after a deployment during that Vietnam era, the answer is no. Most people my age would know that it was a very difficult time for our country. There was much of what happened in the country during the late 1960s that I kind of missed out on. I didn't even know part of what happened during the 60s, the late 60s, particularly while I was on active duty, because I was at sea so much of the time. But at home, we weren't well thought of in the military. And certainly overseas, we had some animosity in several ports that we would visit, particularly in France. French did not like us at all. A lot of other ports, though, we would visit in other countries. They would accept us pretty well, but France was probably the most difficult place to go to visit at all. But at home, no, we were pretty well disliked. Even after I got off active duty, it was not a really pleasant time for veterans. not like it is today. It's a lot different today than it was then. Some of my better experiences, I would say, go back to two in particular, one on active duty and one in my reserve duty. During one of our deployments, destroyers, for people who don't know what destroyers are built for, they have two primary functions. Actually, I have three, but primary functions are chasing submarines and plane guarding for aircraft carriers. And when a destroyer is plane guarding for an aircraft carrier, what they do is if a plane runs into trouble, whether it's landing or taking off, if the pilot has to ditch, then the destroyers that are plane guarding have the responsibility to try to find that individual and return him to the aircraft carrier. During one of our deployments, while we were plane guarding, there was a collision, mid-air collision between two aircraft. And we actually saw a parachute from one of the aircraft, and we were able to pick up the pilot, and our sister ship picked up the co-pilot. So that was, and unfortunately there was a third person associated with that collision, and we searched for that person for 3 days, and unfortunately we were unable to find any remains of the plane or that particular individual. That was kind of sad, but on the other hand, we were able to recover 2 individuals. So that was kind of just one of the better experiences we had. Goes, about what we really did, as a military person. My second, really most, I guess, important part of what I had experienced was after I made Chief Petty Officer. Those people who never served aboard ship don't understand what it is to be a Chief Petty Officer aboard a ship. They are different than regular enlisted individuals. They have their own eating facility within the ship. They're, like I said, they're middle management, so they're treated differently with more respect. It was very important for me to try to experience that if I could while I was in the reserve duty, because a lot of times you may not get to experience that. Well, I had an opportunity. My son was also on active duty at the time in the Navy, and he was serving aboard the USS Cape St. George at the time, and it was stationed out in Norfolk, Virginia. Well, I had an opportunity to complete a 2-week active duty at Norfolk, and at that time his ship was in port, but they were going to go out for 3 days of training, and so I had an opportunity to be on that ship with him while they were on their 3-day training, and that was an experience I thoroughly enjoyed, and just being with my son on board a ship, serving at the same time with him, was really an good experience. I think one of my most important stories that I had is actually when I had a chance to go to Rome while we were in Naples one Christmas, and I was able to go on an organized trip from Naples up to Rome, and on Christmas morning we were able to go to St. Peter's Square and then watch the Pope deliver his Christmas morning, whatever it was, Christmas morning prayers and that sort of thing. But that was sort of an interesting opportunity that not many people get to experience, and I do remember that. It was a lot of fun. In 1967, during the USS Liberty attack, when the Egyptian-Israeli conflict occurred, at that point in time we were on wartime cruising in the Mediterranean, southeast of Italy, and we were on our way to pick up any survivors that we might need to, or evacuate people that we might need to. So, but we did that for about 3 days, and luckily everything calmed down and we were able to go back to port. We ended up going to Crete for several days of liberty. But that was kind of a hair-raising experience for a young kid that was only 18 years old and didn't hardly know anything at the time. I think everyone has probably seen World War II movies and other kinds of movies on the military, particularly the Navy. Or I mean, we had nightly movies. That was always the big thing, particularly when you were at sea. I mean, the movie call was just was really important. But as far as other entertainment, the only entertainment you would really have if you were in port in the United States, you'd have TV, of course. But while you're away from port in a foreign country, you would have Liberty Call, and that would be your other entertainment. There are many types of entertainment, and I'm not going to go into that. I spent most of my time and effort into taking photographs, so that was where I spent most of my off-duty hours, those off-duty hours that I did have in a foreign port, which weren't many. I would go out primarily by myself for the most part and take photographs. Starting in 1982, I started my reserve duty, reserve career. Starting at the bottom, I started as an E3, and I took my own advice. I started advancing as fast as possible, and I made every time I came up for advancement, I was able to make advancement, which was not easy. From an E3 to an E7 in a minimum amount of time is not easy. The Sea Cadet program is probably one of the best kept secrets in the nation as far as youth programs is concerned. And I think it's extremely beneficial to young people. And right now we have young people from starting at the age of 10, it goes through high school. There are actually two programs. There's a Navy League program for 10 to 13, and then 13 through high school is a Sea Cadet program. But in many instances, they really run concurrently. They run together. They really train together. They learn many of the same things. But the things they learn, integrity, leadership, they learn to be just good citizens. That's the overall scope of the program, is to teach them to be just productive citizens. And what they learn, they go on military type trainings, and they get to experience many occupational fields that have equivalents to civilian occupational fields, whether it be law, construction, medical, aircraft maintenance. They get to experience a lot of things that normal high school students would not get to experience. And they get to explore the fields that they're interested in. And many of them actually enter those fields once they complete their chosen field. They get to experience that. They really go into that after they graduate from high school. Now, whether it's a military occupational field that they go into, or whether it's a civilian occupational field. We've had many of our cadets that, we have about 50% of them that enlist in the military, and the other 50% go on to college. And we've had many of them enter, particularly medical field is a very, very good one that we've had a good experience with. We just had one of our former cadets actually actually went to college and became a nurse, and was actually just commissioned in the U.S. Navy as a nurse, as an ensign and a nurse. But it's in many of our cadets, we've had some that have become emergency medical technicians. They've joined the fire departments. We've gone into law enforcement. So they just get to experience so much more than the average high school student does. And I'd like to think that they're head and shoulders above the average high school student when they complete the program. I'm just, it just makes me proud just to work with them. I don't get to work with the cadets as often now as I used to, because I'm now a regional director for the state of Indiana, and we have 9 units in the state, so I'm really supervising 9 units, so I don't get the day-to-day kinds of activities with the cadets that I once did. I really did get involved with it because of my son. I wanted him to get the experiences of a potential Navy career. I never pushed him into enlisting in the Navy, but it was a way for him to learn, kind of change his attitude a little bit, because they learn one of the first things they learn is respect, and respect for authority. And then the other really big thing they learn is leadership over the course of their career in the Sea Cadet program. That's one of the big things we push, is leadership. They don't realize sometimes they learn it, but they do as they go up through the ranks in the cadet program. They do get to learn that, and they actually go to specific schools. They go to leadership schools that enhance what they're learning within the unit. But that's we're raising and really working with our future leaders of the country. And the more we can do to expose them to great leadership skills and what it takes to be a good leader, the first thing they learn is you can't be a good leader without being a good follower. I mean, that's the fact. And so they just learn respect and self-reliance, and they're more respectful to their parents. So that's how I got involved with it, is getting my son oriented, and actually some of his friends actually joined the program. So that was very rewarding and satisfying.
The U.S. Naval Sea Cadet Corps is a youth development program sponsored by the Navy League of the United States and the U.S. Navy and U.S. Coast Guard. Started in 1962, it offers an opportunity for young people to get an exposure to the military through local units in individuals' hometowns, and training opportunities that take place aboard military bases and non-military bases.
I learned about the Sea Cadets actually through both of my older brothers from the program, and it looked like a very good opportunity to learn a lot about our Navy and the, I guess, opportunities that are out there for us after high school.
There's a website that they can go to. It's www.seacadets.org, and that will get them the information they need about the program, and actually tell them where they can learn about where the nearest unit is located and that sort of thing. Or they can call me. It's a very unique shadow box. It's one of a kind. It was built for me by some Seabees, construction battalion guys that I was friends with, and it really depicts my 3 phases of military life before I retired in 2002. You've got my active duty. I think it's my active duty. Active duty over here, and then there's my duty with the Sea Cadets, and then I have my reserve duty over here. That's what the 3 smaller boxes cover, and of course when I retired I got the American flag. So, and I mean, that's why it's kind of important to me, because it was specially built for me. It's not something you can go out and pick up at a store. So that made it kind of special. If they were considering a military duty, I would give them the same 3 pieces of advice I gave my son when he enlisted in 1996. It hasn't changed. And those 3 pieces of advice, particularly in today's military, particularly the Navy does a really good job of this, is to advance as fast as possible. And that's not always easy, but it can be done. To save as much money as possible, and to get as much civilian education as they can get. And that's very possible in today's military world, because they can actually take classes, college classes, while they're at sea or while they're in port. But it definitely, there are opportunities for online training. They can complete a bachelor's degree while they're actually on active duty. And I asked my son to do that. Of course, he didn't, but that's the advice I would give someone, you know, if I were giving advice to a young person thinking about, and I think it's still good advice. I actually did that when I was on active duty. So, you know, I was able to save enough money to buy a brand new car when I got off active duty. So, and in those days, that was not easy. I'm very proud to have been able to serve, particularly given my eyesight restriction. I think it was just a tremendous boost to my self-worth. But just being able to serve and gave me the, I guess, the initiative to actually go forward and you know, seek out my college degree and just work with other people. And now I'm doing a lot of volunteer work. So it just made me very proud to have done that. I think really it would be good for everyone to at least experience something similar to military service. You learn so much more. I think you appreciate it more as you get older. I mean, I certainly have, but I was really very lucky to be able to spend 26 years serving my country.